Is, I guess, a video lecture on W.H. Auden's poem September 1st, 1939. The way we're going to be looking at this poem is going to be, of course, from the perspective of Mod C. So as we talk about this and as I discuss some of these things, it's important to keep in mind some of the main concerns of Mod C, and particularly to keep in mind the concept of representing people in politics. So we're thinking about the nature of representation as a concept. We're thinking about the ways in which authorial intent appears on the level of the language and how that creates this chain starting with the author's own context, which then influences the author to make particular decisions about the text, and the manner in which those decisions then influence the way, in a completely different context, readers will interpret what is said. And we apply this idea to people in politics to think about the interactions between the personal and the political spheres in terms of shared, competing, common, and perhaps not so common political perspectives and events, personas, situations. So from the title, September 1st, 1939, you can probably guess what this poem is about. It was written in 1939. September 1st, 1939 marked the beginning of the Second World War, known to be the bloodiest conflict in modern history. So estimates vary as to the number of people who died. Certainly we're talking in the high 50s in terms of millions of people who have died, so 50 to 60 million casualties overall, and that's just a very rough estimate. Of course, we can never be quite sure. You should, of course, know who the belligerents were in the Second World War. Germany, on the one hand, and the Axis powers more generally. Germany was, of course, ruled by Hitler at the time, Adolf Hitler. And the Allied powers fought against Germany and Japan and Italy and so forth. Most notably, the Allied powers were the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Stalin, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. So September 1st, 1939 marked the day in which Germany's troops entered into Poland and invaded Poland. And Winston Churchill, being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, delivered an ultimatum that Germany should withdraw its troops, and if it did not do so, I think it was by 11 a.m., then a state of war would exist between the two countries. And that's exactly what happened. World War II would finish in 1945, and Europe would take a long, long time to recover from that horror. So it's a pretty important poem because it focuses on a pretty important historical event. And as you've come to expect from Auden, he doesn't do this in a way that's very typical. So there are characteristics of this poem which are very, very unusual in relation to the descriptions of the Second World War, and more specifically, actually, to the ambience surrounding its beginning. It doesn't take too much imagination to sort of think about how you might feel if you were there, sitting like Auden was in one of the bars in 52nd Street, hearing that the Second World War had just started, not knowing when it would end or if it would end, not knowing if or when the countries in question, which countries in question rather, would prevail. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read out this poem, as I typically do with Auden's poetry, so you can get a feel for the cadence of the lines, that is to say, the rhythm and the manner in which they should be read. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about certain broad ideas within this poem, and then go through it line by line and see what there is on the level of the language that affects the way those ideas are presented. September 1st, 1939. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odour of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offence from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic god. I and the public know what all schoolchildren learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy and what dictators do. the elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave. Analysed all in his book, the enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again. Into this neutral air, where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, each language pours its vain competitive excuse. But who can live for long in a euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare, imperialism's face and the international wrong. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out, the music must always play, all the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. The windiest militant trash important persons shout is not so crude as our wish. What mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. For the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. From the conservative dark into the ethical life, the dense commuters come repeating their morning vow, I will be true to the wife. I'll concentrate more on my work, and helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak for the dumb? All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. The romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenceless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So this is one of those typically Auden-like poems where a lot of his ideas are difficult to understand on the first reading. You need a lot of consciousness and a lot of willpower, a lot of mental acuity to understand this poem well. And you need to go over it again and again before you can come to that sort of understanding. But before we start talking about this poem in a lot of detail, there is one key point I would like to make that relates very much to these last lines. Auden is doing what he has done in a number of poems already, and that is that he is expressing some sort of optimistic note at the end of what is otherwise a thoroughly pessimistic, depressing picture of the world. And this is very interesting, because Auden doesn't always do this. In fact, one of the reasons the poems have been set for study in this particular order, and in these particular poems have been set for study, is that you get to observe certain features of Auden's writing and changes in those features. And one of those changes is the extent to which there is a note of optimism at any point in the poetry that Auden writes. But before we get too bogged down in those broad details, let's go back to the beginning and talk a little bit about what this poem actually means. So the first thing to note is that the title isn't accidental. It is, of course, a specific temporal reference, that is to say, a specific reference in a particular point in time. But there's something else to it as well. It's also an intertextual allusion. In this case, Auden is alluding to a poet whom you have already heard of, William Butler Yeats. Now, William Butler Yeats wrote probably his most famous work, a medium-length poem called Easter 1916, to commemorate the Easter Uprising in Ireland. And that poem, if you look it up, you will notice that the way it starts is the speaker finds himself in a particular situation, in a particular circumstance, that he describes. And that circumstance has to do sort of with the opening up of a landscape, as it were, a world in which the action is going to happen. So in the case of Easter 1916, the speaker of Easter 1916 talks about walking along what is presumably sort of a city street, looking at the different buildings around him and meeting the people who are about to participate in the rebellion and who will die doing so. Auden is deliberately mimicking this style. We can tell this from the way that the titles are similar. Easter 1916, September 1st, 1939. They're both merely dates referencing particular events occurring on those dates. And we can also tell that there is this sort of homage that Auden pays to Yeats because of the manner in which his poem starts. So he starts with his speaker in a specific geographical location, and that geographical location starts to evoke the circumstances of the world around the speaker. So Auden, we presume in this poem, because this is probably one of the few times where we have kind of evidence for this, we can moderately safely assume that Auden is the persona. That is to say, Auden the poet imagines himself more or less to be Auden the speaker in this poem. And so the speaker opens the poem with an explanation of where he is. And he says, I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street. So a dive, as you will see on the footnote, is a shabby or a sleazy bar or similar establishment. It's the sort of place you would see in a neo-noir detective story. It's the place where the alcoholic detective with personal problems goes to drink some sort of hard liquor. That sort of dusty, dirty, dank, dark place. It's not a nice bar. Clearly, this is an establishment which is not mainstream. So much so that the use of the word dives is almost pejorative in this sense. It's kind of seedy and run down. The reason I say we seem to have some evidence for Auden being the persona in this case is because of the location that we are given, 52nd Street, and the fact that Auden says specifically it's a dive. What these two things might tell us, if we were to believe one of Auden's biographers, that is to say, one of the people who later on wrote a biography of W.H. Auden, is that this is actually a specific reference to a place called the Dizzy Club, which was a gay bar in New York City. Auden, being gay himself, would probably be somewhat more likely to frequent such a place than the average individual. So this gives us our first sort of tentative bit of evidence that Auden is probably aligning himself with the persona, if not being the persona himself. Whatever the case, though, clearly the setting is established in the first two lines. So I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street. These two lines establish setting. We move on. The next thing we have is a rendition of the emotional circumstances of the event that we are looking at, and therefore of the emotional state of the speaker. He says he is uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. There are lots of things going on in these lines. The first thing is uncertain and afraid is very similar in meaning, because uncertainty and fear often go hand in hand. So the question is, can this be Hendiadys? It certainly seems to border on Hendiadys, except for the fact that we don't really have an obvious way of naturally turning this pair into a modification relationship. So we could say uncertainly afraid or fearfully uncertain, but neither of those is exactly what you would have if you were to take one of these words and make it modify the other without changing the word too much. So it's almost Hendiadys. Certainly this is doubling, though. We have this word here which also fascinates me, the word clever, because by all accounts, in the next couple of lines, whatever hopes that Auden is talking about, he clearly doesn't believe them to be clever. And the reason that's the case is because, number one, they expire, which sort of die, which sort of means die. And secondly, because of the fact that he terms the period in which these hopes arise as a low, dishonest decade. The word clever doesn't quite seem to fit if we take it literally. So there is this very obvious argument that Auden is developing a tone of irony here. When he's saying that the hopes were clever, what he's really saying is that they were misguided. That the things that people were expecting from the years around the Second World War weren't actually reasonable. That is to say, that the circumstances around the Second World War, or in the years before the Second World War, should have allowed people to predict what was going to happen, rather than be surprised that the world was in a war. And this is actually really interesting because there is a certain biographical point here as well. Auden was, amongst other things, known for having expressed an opinion on Hitler's book Mein Kampf. When Auden read Mein Kampf, and he did so before the Second World War started, and therefore in a time when the book was not a historical document, but rather an interesting sort of collection of the mania of a country, of the disease that would infect, I guess, the mentality of a whole country. Auden read Mein Kampf, and having done so, he proclaimed that war was inevitable. That a person who had the opinions expressed in Mein Kampf, who held those opinions, and who was at the helm of a strong country with a strong number of military forces, would not rest until he either destroyed the world or the world destroyed him. So Auden saw the Second World War coming a mile away. Therefore, we have this sort of antithetical relationship between these two lines. You have clever hopes, antithesis. So we have this antithetical relationship. We have the concept of cleverness, and we have the concept of that cleverness being sort of inverted, subverted, undermined, and thrown away. Low and dishonest are both, of course, low and dishonest are both, of course, highly pejorative terms. So that's all well and good. There's also something else going on here. In terms of the language, in terms of the rhyme more specifically. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think kind of carefully about how it is that these lines rhyme, you'll see that they don't actually rhyme quite as you would expect them to. So if you read them, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low dishonest decade, you can see that there's something about afraid and decade. They seem to end on a similar sound. Now, end rhyme proper, that is to say, what we typically think of as rhyme, means that within the final stressed syllable of two words, the nucleus, or the vowel, is the same, and everything following the vowel, in this case it's called the coda, is also the same. So, afraid, decade. They both have a, the diphthong, the diphthong vowel, which is the same, and d, the plosive at the end. So it seems that they would rhyme completely, but there's something that's not quite there, that's missing. And what's missing is that the word decade is trochaic rather than iambic. So we would say decade, but we would say afraid. And because the stress is on this syllable here, but not on this syllable here, we kind of feel uncomfortable with the rhyme. Now what's going on is actually a little bit more involved even than that, because if you wanted them to rhyme properly, what you would have to do is you would have to pronounce the word decade as iambic. And if you did that, it would sound decayed. That is, decayed. So what you have here, believe it or not, is some sort of metrical pun on the concept of decay coming from decade. Another term for this might be slant rhyme. So slant rhyme is this sort of circumstance that occurs where the metrical patterns aren't the same of the two words that are rhyming, and so you have to sort of slightly alter one of them in order for the rhyme to work as maybe it is intended to work. Okay. The next thing we see is an examination further of the emotional circumstances surrounding the event that we're looking at. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. We have something going on in terms of non-literal language, quite clearly, waves. Anger doesn't really come in waves, at least not literally. So you can think of this as a metaphor. What sort of metaphor depends on how you characterize this. If I was not inclined to think too much about this, which I'm really not because I don't think it's particularly important, I would just be happy to call it an oceanic metaphor and leave it at that. If you so wanted, you might find another word which means to do with the patterns of the waves, or tidal patterns. Again, we have doubling, anger and fear. Uncertain and afraid, anger and fear. This doubling, of course, mirrors the previous doubling. And this is the second time, therefore, that Auden is taking these two emotions, which are generally quite distinct, and he is combining them into the one. That's interesting, because Auden is now not just offhandedly commenting on what's going on, he is making a very deliberate comment about the way the human psyche works, and about the way humans sort of may start with one emotion, like anger, and move to another emotion, like fear. That is to say, he sees a causality between them. These waves of anger and fear, Auden tells us, circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth. We have another extended metaphor going on here, but before we talk about what it means, let's just note that we, of course, have the metaphor dependent upon the concept of light and the concept of dark. And the manner in which these two are treated means, or the fact that they are treated at all, means we've got chiaroscuro operating in this particular section of the poem. What does this metaphor mean? This is kind of up to you to interpret. There are various possible interpretations of bright and darkened lands of the earth. Clearly, Auden is drawing some sort of dichotomy between two concepts here. What that dichotomy is really anyone's guess. If you were to ask a typical sort of conservative British individual at this point what the bright and darkened lands of the earth are and what they mean, you might get an imperialist perspective on it, which is sort of very typical of that British imperialist mentality, where the bright are the civilized places, the dark places are the ones that are sort of savage and uninhabited. And of course, if you've ever studied Heart of Darkness, or any text from the post-colonial era, or from the colonial era, you'll know exactly how familiar this attitude is. There are other interpretations as well. Perhaps the bright lands of the earth are the ones that have been spared the scourge of war, and the darkened lands are the ones where war is going on. It could be, alternatively, that Auden is viewing the Allied powers, or at the very least, at this point in 1939, it was just the UK and France as kind of the bright areas, and the darkened lands as the Axis powers, Germany and Italy and Japan. So it's up to you what you think of this particular part of the poem. But clearly, whatever you think about it, there is this obvious interpretation of the circumstances, or the circumstance of the events that we're looking at. That is to say, Auden is kind of looking at the atmosphere, the feeling surrounding the beginning of the Second World War, and he's giving us an image of what that's like. Whatever else we might think of this metaphor, the word bright has to be a probative. That is to say, it's clearly a positively connoted term. So maybe this is this concept of hope. Auden is perhaps, possibly, suggesting that there's something to sort of be gained from thinking about and engaging with areas of the world which have not been suffering at the hands of war. I don't know. It's up to you to interpret this. I'm very interested in this line, obsessing our private lives. Not only because clearly we have this concept of the private life no longer being private, public affairs intruding on the circumstances of our individual lives, which is, of course, exactly what People and Politics is all about. But also because there is this inverse relationship as well. As we will see later, one of the things that Auden believes very, very strongly is that private failings in character, failings in attitude, on the individual level, are what ultimately bring about suffering and unpleasantness and things like war and destruction and famine on the broader level. Which is an interesting point to make, and it seems to me a fairly reasonable one, because ultimately politics is about individuals who come together and create something which is possibly more than the net sum of those individuals. But clearly, the type of individuals that go into politics determine greatly the outcome or outcomes that might come about from their involvement. So this is sort of foreshadowing what Auden... Sorry, let me rephrase that. The thing I am about to say kind of foreshadows what Auden later expresses clearly in this poem. But one of the things that Auden talks about one of the things that Auden means when he develops this concept of the private life affecting the public life is that self-absorption and egoism and solipsism on the individual level are some of those characteristics that cause much worse, much more sort of unspeakable sufferings on the broader level. Okay. The unmentionable odour of death offends the September night. Whenever you have a word like unmentionable in a speech or in a poem or in any bit of writing generally, you should immediately start to question what this means, because it is a logical fallacy, right? If something is unmentionable and yet you are mentioning it, then there's something not going quite right, or you're striving to achieve a particular effect. We've seen this technique before, in fact, and we've seen sort of variations on it. So we've seen metanoia. Metanoia was a rhetorical technique of correction or changing one's mind, where a speaker says something and then retracts it. There are other things that are going on as well. So one of the things that's going on here, apart from the concept of metanoia, of course this isn't exactly metanoia, is something very similar, which is apophasis. Now, if you remember what apophasis was, I'll write it here. It comes from Greek, I believe, and it means to say no. So apophasis is basically a rhetorical device where a subject is brought up by a speaker, and the manner in which it's brought up is by denying that subject or denying that it should be brought up. So we've seen this before, and you see it all the time in politics. The leader of the opposition might stand up and he might say something like, "And I don't even need to tell the House of all of the corrupt business dealings of the Prime Minister." And although he says he doesn't need to tell them, of course he tells them, and by doing so he brings attention to the corrupt business dealings of the Prime Minister. Again, this isn't quite the same as saying that something cannot be expressed, which is why there's another better term which we also have seen, and that is paralypsis. Paralypsis is exactly this. It is another rhetorical technique where a concept is brought up, but the manner in which it's brought up is by saying that it cannot be brought up, or that it is impossible to express it. Which is exactly what we have here. Auden is mentioning this idea of death, basically, and he's doing it by saying it's unmentionable. Now, it sort of stands to reason, or it's useful for us to sort of step back a little bit from this and start thinking about why he calls it unmentionable, apart from the fact that he wants to bring up the concept of death. And if you sort of get out of the mindset of, English studying a poem and think more broadly in the mindset of, say, rhetoric, or the things that are acceptable and not acceptable to say at the beginning of something like a war, then you should quite clearly see that the concept of death is kind of taboo. What I mean by this is that when a war starts, it's not the most comfortable thing in the world, and not the most easy thing in the world, to look the truth in the face, that there will be people dying as a consequence of the events that are happening now, and the next level of that truth is that some of these people you might know, some of these people might be your family, they might even be you. So of course it's unmentionable. Nobody wants to think about the concept of death, particularly an unnatural death, as a consequence of war. But Auden brings it up anyway, and he brings it up by reminding us that it is actually a very uncomfortable thing to recognise, but that it should be recognised nonetheless. There's also the question of how Auden actually expresses this. We have another metaphor here, because of course death doesn't have an odour. What sort of imagery is this? It's olfactory, therefore it's smelling, and this is of course an olfactory metaphor. Olfactory metaphor. This imagery is also very vivid. Whenever you have something as vivid as this, a line like the unmentionable odour of death, it's so very obviously it's so very obviously vivid, it's so very obviously distressing, that you really should characterize it as such, evaluate it as such in, for example, your essay. So you might say, for instance, this highly distressing olfactory metaphor. You don't have to do this very often, but when we've got an opportunity like this, you might as well take it, right? Offends the September night. You feel like there's something that's not quite right here. The word offends doesn't seem to be strong enough, right? We've got this unmentionable odour of death. This imagery is so infernal and so vivid and so dark that offends is kind of like, so what? In other words, when Auden says it offends the September night, number one, he's layering another metaphor within his metaphor, now characterizing sort of the response of the world, I guess, or the response of the environment to the circumstances of war. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly than this, Auden is using an understatement. It's a trope in and of itself. So the proper name of the trope is meiosis. Sorry. Meiosis. Why is Auden understating it? Why does he not say assaults the September night? Why does he not say destroys the September night? Why does he not say makes the September night unbearable? And the reason, I suspect, is that Auden is, by this point, starting to comment on where he is at this moment and of the attitude of his country to the war. That is to say, there is a historical point that Auden is making. That historical point has to do with the United States of America. So Auden, as I mentioned before, or the speaker at any rate, is sitting in a dive, a sleazy club on 52nd Street in New York City, possibly called the Dizzy Club. And he is as far away from the war as is probably possible. So the timeline of the Second World War goes roughly, very, very, very roughly, something like this. 1939 is when the Second World War starts, with the United Kingdom and France declaring war on Germany, Germany having invaded Poland. In 1941, Germany's troops, under the directions of Hitler, attack the Soviet Union, and the USSR, the Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, joins the Second World War in the fight against Germany and the Axis powers. In 1944, and only in 1944, does the United States open the second front against Germany. Before that time, the United States was fighting Japan. It was providing aid to the other Allied countries. It was not actively, American soldiers were not actively fighting Germany. In other words, it would be a full 5 years from when this was written to the point where America would actually be actively involved in the Second World War. And of course, the war was won a year after that by the Allied powers. So really, America joined it only at the very, very end. The upshot of this is that at this point, the United States is completely disconnected from the war. It's a long distance away geographically. It is a long distance away mentally. The average American citizen at this point, in September of 1939, does not genuinely think that he or she is going to have a bomb dropped on his or her head the next, day or at any point in the foreseeable future. In other words, the threat of war is a threat, it is real, but it's sort of, in a sense, almost theoretical, almost in the distance, somewhere far on the horizon for the average American citizen. So the word offends is quite appropriate here then, because in a sense, for the average American citizen, it's not the case that the Second World War has any specific, immediate, damaging consequences at this point. At this point, the United States is somewhat disconnected from the war. They will get updates on the war by telegraph and by newspaper, but for the most part, they are not, the citizens of the United States, the people living on the mainland and the United States holdings, I guess, are not going to be affected at this point in the way that citizens, say, of Britain would be, who had to, amongst other things, run to air raid shelters whenever it was possible that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was dropping bombs on them. So all of this really means is that Auden is pointing out, or hinting at for the first time in this text, hinting at the fact that the United States is disconnected from the war and making a comment on that. And if you've paid attention to the reading of the text, you will know that later on, he does kind of something more explicit about this point. One of his key concerns in this poem is about the role that America plays in the Second World War. At this point, I'm going to leave the recording. We will come back to this poem in the next recording. Hope that was useful.